Hey guys, welcome to the Health Babes podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Becky Campbell with Dr. Crystal Hohn. And today we have Amanda Montalvo on. She is a women's health dietitian. She talks about hormones, but with a little bit different perspective, which is very interesting. She talks about why minerals are so important for our hormone health and what signs and symptoms you should be looking for to know if you need mineral hair testing. And it's just really amazing how she explained how the minerals really support everything in the body. So let's welcome Amanda to the show. We are so happy to have you here. We've been following you for a while on Instagram. You have a really, really great Instagram. If you guys don't follow Amanda on Instagram, you have to, because she has really digestible information. So we love it.
Thank you. Yeah, a lot of effort goes into that. So that's always really nice to hear.
It really does.
You do a great job. You really do. And I've even learned some things, and it's just great. It's great when we all can come together and better our patients.
Yes. And it's nice because, Instagram is it's so amazing in so many ways, but it can definitely be, something that people get like addicted to and obsessed with and makes them more stressed. So it's, got to keep it a positive space.
That's so true. Yeah. All right. So I love your story. And it's a story that we've heard many times, from people coming to see us. So can you kind of talk to us about how you got started in women's health?
Yeah. So I was pretty young. I was about 20 years old, and I had made all these lifestyle changes. I had just got into CrossFit, and I found paleo, and it was like really just rocking my whole world and changing everything that I was learning in school because I was studying to be a dietitian. So I was like, oh, this feels like the opposite of everything that I'm learning. And I started cleaning up my lifestyle, which kind of brought me to this place of I'm taking this birth control pill every single day, and I don't really know what it's doing to my body. And I just was like, yeah, I just don't feel comfortable with this anymore. So my doctor was like, yeah, just stop taking it. You'll be fine. I thought nothing of it, stopped taking it. And then that's really where my health journey started, because everything went downhill. I didn't get my period back for almost a year. All of a sudden my hair is falling out. I had acne, but it got way worse. I mean, I was like, this is all from stopping this pill. So that's really when I'm going to doctors, I'm trying to get answers. And I was like, no one knows anything about this. This was also over 12 years ago. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we didn't have this kind of information like we do online. The things that I share, I'm like, if I knew this stuff back then, my life would be so different. But it was one of those things where I just started doing more research because I'm like, no one knows anything about this. The only solution is to go back on the pill, to take Synthroid, and that's literally it. They're like, you just have to go back on the pill and your period will come back. And they weren't concerned. Like, do you want to have kids right now? I'm like, no, I'm 20. And they're like, okay, then just don't worry until you decide you want to have kids. So it was all very, very disheartening. And that's really what switched my focus from sports nutrition to women's health. And yeah, it really led to a ton of research. Diving into that's how I found Dr. Jolene Brighton and everything. And she was the first person that I really found talking about this stuff.
Yeah. And we see that so often with people on the birth control pill. When they get off of it, they're like, oh my gosh, I'm having this and this, name the symptom. And it's hard because a lot of the times they were put on it when they were so young and it was not even used for contraception. It's just, there's so much to it. And I think people don't really realize what it's doing, putting you into this chemically induced menopausal state at however old, 15, 20, whatever age. It's crazy. And that's why we love people like you who just try to get the word out about this, because parents don't know either. Mm-hmm. And we want everyone to understand no one's trying to tell anyone they made a mistake. We're trying to tell you ahead of time, listen, this is what this does, just so you know, right?
Yeah.
And avoid the things that can come with that.
And some people have no issues. Some people come off and they don't have any problems, but I would say more often than not, most women experience some concern within the first year after coming off of the pill. And I think because my health was so good otherwise, and I hadn't really had any issues other than painful periods, which is why I went on the pill in the first place.
Yeah.
I also didn't think about that either. I didn't think about how painful my periods would be when I got it back. And it's just, it's one of those things where we're doing the best you can with the knowledge that you have, but hopefully, and maybe it doesn't mean someone chooses like not to take it. Maybe they take it, but they're like, but I'm going to do these other things to like support my liver and then help my body come off.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. So you talk so much about minerals, and we definitely want to dive into this. Why is focusing on minerals so important for our hormones?
It's so important for everything. It's so funny because when I talk to my other functional dietitian friends about like the root cause, it's always like minerals and like mold and trauma, it's like something like that. But like minerals always are in there. And that's really because they act like cofactors. They're like little spark plugs in our bodies that kick off different reactions. So they're those things that they don't get a lot of attention. Although I feel like now people talk about them, which is great.
Yeah.
But they don't get a ton of attention. And it's something where, if you talk to your doctor about like wanting to look at your mineral status, they're like, well, typically in our country, we don't have these types of deficiencies. Same thing with like vitamins. And I'm like, we definitely do. But, because we're well fed, depending on how you define that, we should technically not really be dealing with these deficiencies. They're supposed to be rare. But what I came to learn, especially on my own journey, I had a lot of copper imbalances because the pill can raise your copper levels, but I also had the copper IUD, which was like, a whole thing for me. I can't believe I had that in for so long. And that really brought me to minerals because I had such obvious like copper issues. But then I started to learn so much more, how important like potassium is for utilizing thyroid hormone in our blood sugar. And I started to make these connections of like, wow, these are a lot of minerals that most people are depleted in from stress because we use up a lot of minerals during that stress response. And they're not really highlighted. And it's such a quick fix that usually gives people good results, often pretty quickly. And it's like a win that you can experience right away. But they're just not talked about as often.
Yeah, it's true. I had the copper IUD too, but I pretty much was hemorrhaging from it. It made me, and I passed out one day at work and I was like, well, I'm taking this out. And I was lucky. I mean, I think I was lucky because it made me not have an issue with copper because I didn't have it in that long. But we see it all the time in practice. We see people with really high copper levels and we're like, what do you, and then we don't realize they have the Paragard and all that. So it's people just, there's so many things that they, that are done in certain realms of health, and we just don't know what the kind of side effect is going to be sometimes. And so you think something like they try to make it non-hormonal to help people, but then it's like, then there's copper issues. So it's really important to kind of learn about that and understand that.
And I don't know how much research you guys have looked at with the copper IUD. It was like, it's something I've had a lot of clients with issues around it. And I'm like, I mean, there's got to be research that shows it causes issues. Like, there's no way. And there is. And a lot of it's around the oxidative stress. And I do think it causes excess copper for some people, but it's a very tiny amount of copper it's putting off in the body. But I think if you're already have copper imbalances and like vitamin A deficiencies, you're much more susceptible to that like copper excess anyway. But there's like 2 good research articles I was looking at, and they basically recommend like after 2 to 3 years, you should get it taken out and replaced or removed because of the oxidative stress. Like it raised people's liver enzymes, their CRP levels. And I'm like, no doctor talks about this. And
they probably don't know,
Yeah.
Okay. So for those who are listening to this and are like, okay, how do I know if I need mineral testing, hair mineral testing? So what are some common signs and symptoms? And I know you probably think most people do. I mean, it couldn't hurt, right?
Yeah.
if someone who's like, well, I need a sign that I need this, what would you say, like signs and symptoms that would indicate the need for this type of testing?
I would say like burnout, especially that's not being like fixed by other things that you're doing. Like if you have
Yeah.
like a lot of fatigue, you feel like you don't handle stress well, that's a huge red flag for me. And then if you have a lot of symptoms of hypothyroidism, but say you've gotten your blood work,
Yeah.
and they're like, your thyroid's totally fine, it's normal, which it most likely isn't optimal, but maybe you're like subclinical hypothyroidism, where it's like, it's not bad enough for them to do anything about it, but it's not great.
Right.
Those are times when I'm like, minerals can be so, so helpful for those people, because it's typically deficiencies or excesses. We can have like an excess of copper, like we were talking about, that can cause issues, or excess of iron, that sort of thing. Then that, I feel like that's a population that can get like the best results the quickest. But anyone that's been on birth control, maybe they're coming off or they want to come off soon, I'm like, hair testing helps so much, because the minerals are very supportive of liver detoxification. And that is so much of what we're struggling with when we make that transition off hormonal birth control. So like those are people that I really like to do hair mineral testing. And then if someone is struggling, like maybe they feel like they don't detoxify well, or they don't like tolerate, maybe they try to do gut protocols and that doesn't go well. I see that all the time. And it's typically because their body's just too depleted in general, and they're kind of in that burnout, like kind of end stage of stress. Those are the people that if you can start working on minerals and building a solid foundation, then most often you can work on those deeper root causes. Like maybe you do have a gut issue that you need to address, but your body's like not resilient enough to do that yet.
I love that. I love that. What macro, because with a hair mineral test, it's very broad, lots of minerals on there, and, you can test a lot. Can you kind of talk about some of the big macro minerals that you focus on? I love the way you explain these.
Yeah. So when you get a hair test back, first of all, you're like, why are these lines going like all the way up the screen here? And it's not as straightforward as reading blood work. And I've gotten in so many discussions with dietitians. They're like, they really don't like hair testing. They're like, but it shows you the last few months. It's not accurate. I'm like, I would love to see the last few months for a client. You never get to see that.
Right.
So like you get to see like the last few months, and you're looking at how you're using minerals. And the minerals I really like to focus on, especially on a first test for someone, is calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium. And those are like your main minerals or macro minerals. And calcium, that's one where a lot of people may assume that they need more calcium, but we often see high levels of calcium on hair tests. And that can happen from many things, but a lot of it's coming from that chronic stress over time. Also, if you have hard water, so, make sure you look at your water before you do your hair test. Otherwise you'll be very angry. Because you're like, why is this calcium not going down? Typically it's from that hard water, but excess vitamin D supplementation, that can drive up calcium and definitely lead to imbalances with copper. But a lot of it I see is like stress or not getting enough calcium rich foods in your diet. And then magnesium, I mean, that one, I feel like everyone knows about magnesium, and it's very heavily focused on, and it's such an important mineral. It really is so important for our blood sugar, our stress response, all these different things. It helps us make energy in the body. So without that, of course, you're going to be struggling with things like fatigue, thyroid issues, but it's something that most people are supplementing with, I think, too early, because they're not addressing their sodium and potassium first, which that's my favorite place for people to start, because we're all using up sodium and potassium with the stress response. A lot of people do not get enough potassium from the foods that they're eating,
especially if they're low histamine, like because of a lot of like avocado, oranges, all that stuff can't have.
I know. Oh yeah. Histamine issues are the worst, but they're often mineral related with like copper, or iron imbalances. I see a lot of histamine issues with excess iron. But yeah, those are the minerals I like to have people start with, and focusing on potassium and sodium. I mean, sodium's easy. I think we can all use sea salt. Most of us do.
Yeah.
And then people will add in magnesium, and they're like, wow, I actually feel a difference, or I tolerate this much better. So those are the macro minerals. They have the biggest influence on all the rest of our minerals. So if you can focus on those first, you can even see changes without even addressing other mineral levels at first.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you talk about how that supporting the minerals is essential when working on hormones. So can you kind of talk about how you link that?
Yeah. So, because obviously that's my main focus. People are like,
Right.
why are you talking about minerals so much? Because everyone thinks, oh, I should do hormone testing, right? And I'm like, if you have not addressed like so many other things first, I think it's throwing out your money, because you could probably guess what your hormones are going to be based on your symptoms. And if you haven't addressed other areas, again, like your hormones are the last thing to change. I always say like they're the last stop on
They
that
take
train
the
in that healing
longest,
journey.
that's
They
for sure.
do.
They do.
Yeah.
And so if you can work on your minerals first, that's going to help support your thyroid and your metabolism and how much energy you make. And that's going to trickle down and affect everything. It's going to affect your digestion, because if you aren't, if you don't have a well-functioning thyroid, you're not going to make enough stomach acid. You're probably going to have slower motility. That's going to impact your gut health. And then of course, like liver, gallbladder, stool, like that's how we're getting rid of a lot of estrogen and toxins, which those will come back to bite you if you're not eliminating properly. And that's all going to impact your adrenals, and that access with our ovaries and our adrenals and thyroid. And it's just, everything is so connected. And so I find that if you can work on your foundation with minerals first, and most of that is really just looking at like food and stress, because stress is how we're using up those minerals, then that's going to help set you up for success to have that optimal thyroid function, have that really good digestion, make sure that your liver is detoxifying well. So that puts you on that road of success for eventually achieving hormone balance.
Isn't stress at the root cause of everything?
Every darn thing.
And that's why I love hair testing. And a lot of my colleagues that they focus on stress, they like it because you literally see your stress response, and it's like your unique fingerprint of stress. Like, and it's cool to see for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you're looking at a hair analysis, it can be an intimidating test. I was listening to another podcast with you on there, and I loved how you explained this. You're looking at like three main things. So looking at a metabolic type, can you talk about the other things that you look at too?
So in like the top right-hand corner of a hair test, it'll say your metabolic type, and it's either going to say fast or slow, and then it has a number next to it. And that is really looking at, like, for me, I'm mostly gaining like, what is this person's stage of stress, like, and how dysfunctional are they? Because typically you want to be a slow one or a fast one. And the further you get away from that 1, 2, 3, or 4, the more dysfunction you have in your body, because your organ systems aren't like lining up. They're starting to get out of balance. So that's like one of the big things I look at, and I think is helpful for people to kind of gauge. Because it's like, okay, my minerals, they're never always perfect. Like, you're not trying to achieve a perfect hair test. You're trying to look at, am I really stressed? Is this an appropriate response for me? Because, if you're stressed, it's not bad to have a stress response.
Right.
But if you're super stressed and all your minerals are like super low, then that's going to be a big red flag. So looking at that metabolic type is really helpful. And then looking at that pattern of your main minerals, I really like to understand, like, are they close to that optimal line, or a lot of them high? Are you losing a lot of minerals? That's energy lost, right? So a lot of people will be struggling with fatigue that have those excess high mineral levels because they're losing that energy. And then there is a section for heavy metals on there, and then significant ratios. The metals always get people too, because they're like, oh my gosh, I don't have any heavy metals. I'm like, it shows what you're like, what's leaving your hair, like what your body's getting rid of. And it's always the retest that they see the high levels of, because they're working on detox, and their body's getting the nutrients it needs to work properly. And it's not a bad thing. It's just a piece of information. And then the ratios are really cool, especially if you're looking at a retest for yourself, because sometimes you're like, is this getting better? Like, did my results improve? Obviously you want to pay attention to how you feel. Right. I hope that goes without saying. But sometimes we can get very attached to our test results. And so understanding, like, have my ratios improved? That is always really nice, because sometimes you don't see the biggest change in your minerals unless you look at these tests all the time. Like, I'll look at a test and be like, oh my gosh, this is such a big improvement. And someone's like, it is? Like, what?
Right.
because you're not necessarily looking at them. But if you look at your ratios, that gives you insight into like, how is your metabolism doing? How is your nervous system, your blood sugar ratio, your adrenal ratio? It has some copper and zinc balance on there, which can give some insight into hormones, but I don't think it really correlates that much in practice. But that's it. When you learn how to read it, I feel like it's easy. It's just, it's not super intuitive when you first look at it.
Yeah.
Okay. So what do you think, let's say someone shows up deficient in A, B, and C, right? What do you think about taking minerals via supplementation versus food?
I think it depends on the mineral, because some minerals are really hard to get adequate amounts from food, especially to fix a deficiency.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the big takeaway. Like, even when we look at what like the recommendations are, like the RDAs for these minerals, it's not based off deficiency. It's based off like a normal, healthy person.
Right.
So like magnesium, I don't think anyone's going to get enough of magnesium from food, especially if they have a deficiency.
Yeah.
And the stress that we're all
yeah.
under, like really and truly, we're just
Absolutely.
bleeding.
Especially if you have really high magnesium on your hair test, you're using up a lot. You have higher requirements. And then I think potassium is a mixed one for me because of the histamine and gut issues, right? Like some people, I think people do better when they take it from food, like they increase their levels more efficiently, but some people have a hard time because they have limited foods that they can tolerate. So that's one I think is like a little bit mixed, but and there's some foods that are really high levels of potassium that you could focus on. And then, I mean, pretty much I would say most minerals except for like iodine, I don't think you can get enough from food at all. And that's when I really like to use with people. That's how I got off thyroid medication, utilizing iodine responsibly with its cofactors. Don't just go take iodine, anyone.
Yeah.
Work with
Very
somebody that
important
knows.
note.
Yes.
Yeah. And like make sure you have enough selenium, because that's people like they get issues with autoimmune conditions and their antibodies increasing. I'm like, it probably means that you don't have enough selenium and other cofactors. But yeah, like iodine, I think that one's like a hard one to get from food. So that's typically one that I would have someone supplement with, but it's mixed. Like if you can get it from a food-based supplement, that would be ideal. Because then again, you're going to have to start paying attention to like, okay, well, what minerals does this compete with? If someone takes a copper supplement that does not have any zinc in it because it's not food-based, then that could create some imbalances with zinc, or even manganese. So that's why food, I feel like, is just easier across the board because it's, nature's smart. It already has a balance of different minerals that are competing with each other in there.
I feel like copper is a really big one to point out. It can be really dangerous in a supplement form. I've seen people be really set off from taking copper.
Yeah, especially if like they don't have enough vitamin A too. It's just like, it's usually not that they need more copper. I rarely see someone needs like 20 milligrams plus of copper that they couldn't get from like beef liver. It's usually that they need other nutrients to make that copper more bioavailable.
Exactly. Such a good point.
Can we talk some more about nutrient dense foods, especially with minerals and a lot of the things that we're talking about? Because this is so important, long term for patients and for listeners, right?
Yeah, I love just a mix of animal and plant foods. I know that there's so much controversy around like
us too, though. Protein, bring it on. Organs,
I know.
So hit that hard.
Organ meats are huge. I would say organ meats are probably one of my favorite like healing foods. I think that they're truly healing for people because of the minerals, but also like vitamin A. I mean, it's really hard to get enough retinol from food alone, depending on what you're eating. But if you do eat organ meats, you can that's like takes away one supplement that you really shouldn't need. And then, like I said, copper, they're like basically like a food-based multivitamin is like how I look at them. But they can be really hard for people to eat if you didn't grow up eating them. Like I did not. So I have to hide liver. I mean, I've gotten so good at it because I hated it so much. So anything like saucy, put liver in it. I just blend it up and make it like a really thin puree so that I could mix it and like hide it in things. But that is one that I think is so worth it. And I know you can purchase like beef liver supplements, but it can get expensive doing that. So if you can find ways to sneak it into your food, and then I get people are like, well, is it enough? I'm like, well, how much were you doing before? Nothing.
Yeah.
Right. So we're
Yeah.
increasing, and not trying to feel like like you have to get the same amount in every single day, you know, like really trying to work it more into your lifestyle. So like I love liver, and then organ meats for sure. Like there's so much selenium in beef kidney. It's crazy.
Yes.
You know, like little things like that. And that's like great for people that have histamine issues. But organ meats for sure. I also really like dairy. I see so many people that have issues with not getting enough calcium, especially like if you're a fast metabolic type, you're usually burning through it, and they're trying all these other sources of calcium. And that's always my goal with someone, if they can't tolerate dairy, is to figure out the gut issues so that
Like
they
why
can.
exactly.
Right.
Like, let's work on that. It's and it's got like lots of retinol in there. Also, it's a great source of potassium too.
Fat, protein.
Yeah. So
Yeah, dairy's making a big comeback. I mean, it really is.
I love it. And I still get so many people that are like, I thought dairy was not good for your hormones. I'm like, oh, it's not the dairy. It's like if you can't digest it well, you
It's
know, and it
why.
creates an inflammatory reaction in your body. But the goal should always be to, you know, be able to include that. Yeah. So like animal foods, dairy, I think is great. I love eggs. They're another such a nutrient dense one, and such a fast, easy protein to incorporate on a regular basis. And then I like root veggies are definitely my go-to, because especially for carbs, because they're going to give you that potassium. And potassium, people worry about carbs, and I totally understand that. I had PCOS. There's going to be that concern there, but if you can balance it with protein, and then if you focus on potassium rich carbs, potassium helps shuttle glucose inside the cell. So again, I'm like, nature is very smart. So if we can try to incorporate more of those whole foods and like less things that have been like processed and messed with, I think that's when we can really achieve that balance. But potassium was one, like everyone that follows me is like, I'm always like, all right, so here's like 10 ideas how to get more potassium. Coconut water obviously is a great source as well. Aloe vera juice has like a ton of potassium. And people are always like, oh my gosh, like my digestion's better after just not even getting a ton, like even just adding like a couple 1,000 milligrams in from food a day, you can see a big difference. But I really like that mix of like animal and plant foods and not going to any extreme.
1,000%. Balance.
We just released a book on hormone health, and someone wrote us a review, and she was like, this is a low carb diet. And we're like, no, it's actually not. We're just not eating like processed carbs. We're eating whole foods for the carbs, that like everything you named. I want to point out too, there's a company called Force of Nature. Have you heard of them?
Yeah.
And they put organ meats in your meat. So I buy that for my kids and myself because I don't like organ meats, but they'll put it in, like you can get bison or grass-fed beef, and they put a percentage of organ meats in mixed with that. And it's really good. And I mean,
you can't like tell
it and whatever, you can't tell.
Yeah. And I always mix it with like ground beef too. And that's what it's like hard to hide it in things, but it is worth it. I find chili is the easiest because there's so many like sauces, and I always put cacao powder, and the cacao powder just like completely hides it.
If only we could all be Paul Saldino and like on testicles that are raw and be fine. We'd be great.
I know. I think sometimes I think people won't even attempt, or they feel like it's out of reach. Yeah. They're like, I'm never gonna, but especially if you like do a hair test, maybe you haven't made a lot of changes yet. I'm like, it doesn't matter. It should be one change at a time and just going really slowly. And organ meats is a great first one to start with if you don't already include them. And then if you really hate it and you don't want to take the capsules, you can open up the capsules. That's how my nephew gets the beef liver in, because my sister hides the capsules in different foods, but there's ways to work it in.
Yeah.
There's some great
Amanda,
supplements out
I
there.
wanted to
that have-
ask you too. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Beck.
That's okay.
But you talk a lot about adrenal cocktails and stuff, and you have some great recipes for them. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about them, but could you share for who they're good for, who maybe shouldn't be drinking them, like just, certain scenarios or what you think?
Yeah, so I love adrenal cocktails. I feel like they've gotten so popular now that everyone recommends adrenal cocktails. And if you're like, what is this? It's pretty much it's a combination of sodium, potassium, whole food, vitamin C. And those are the things that ideally you're utilizing to support those adrenals and to improve that sodium potassium status on a hair test. And you can't make it incorrectly. So whenever like I share recipes, someone's like, but I don't want to have X, Y, and Z in there. I'm like, you can't mess it up. You can have whatever you want in there, but it's usually some type of citrus juice because that's what's going to give you the vitamin C. And then coconut water gives you potassium, and then a pinch of sea salt for that sodium. I think that's like the easiest way, but how you drink it, I think anyone can have them. It's just how you're going to drink it and when. That's going to be like different for each person. I think the biggest mistake people make is having the orange juice adrenal cocktail and not having it with anything, or having it on empty stomach and then wondering like, I didn't feel good after that. So like you typically would have it like soon after a meal or with a snack. If someone has like, bigger blood sugar concerns, maybe they actually know that they have insulin resistance, I would do the lighter version, which I just put lime juice, coconut water, and sea salt. It's very light. It's not hard on your blood sugar. And people will still get worried about coconut water. And I'm like, it's like 10 grams of carbs that are going to be in the drink. And they're full of potassium.
Full of potassium.
Yeah.
I drink those. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's like, I drank that my whole pregnancy. And like, I was obsessed with the limeade version of it. It was ridiculous. I had like so many every single day. I still am like on that limeade kick. But it's cool because I wore a CGM with it, and I experimented days of like not having any adrenal cocktails and then having it. My blood sugar was so much better when I drink coconut water. It was like shocking. I was like, oh my gosh, is this good? Like it just shows you like that potassium is so helpful, especially like if you're dealing with like broken sleep and like stress and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, like there's many different recipes, and I have a lot of people that are like, I can't tolerate any citrus because like the histamine. If you can't get a vitamin C source in there, it's still worth drinking. Coconut water, sea salt, doesn't have to be crazy. You can do aloe vera juice if you want, because that has a ton of potassium in there. I like the inner leaf one. It's easier on digestion.
And just be careful because you can get diarrhea.
The inner leaf one, I don't usually see that with. I think it's the outer leaf because it's got the more gut irritating.
Because some people will use that for constipation. You know.
Yeah.
And two, just a note on the coconut water, when you're saying people say it's high in sugar, it's usually because there's added sugar in a lot of the brands. So you have to find where it's literally just real coconut water, just from the coconut, nothing added.
And people usually ask like, what's your favorite brand? I feel like I get a different one in each store that I go to, but I always just get the store brand, because the store brand where I live is almost always just coconut water. I feel like all the other like name brands, they're the ones that have the added sugar and ascorbic acid and all the different ingredients. So
These
I think
are usually more expensive. Don't you feel too?
Significantly.
Yeah.
Those chemicals are expensive.
I know. So I think anyone can drink adrenal cocktails. I just would be mindful and honestly, like experiment. Like it might be so like the most optimal technically like in the morning and afternoon, but I have so many people that have them before bed because it helps them sleep through the night. It doesn't have to be like, there's always like general recommendations, but try to pair it close to a meal or snack if you're worried about blood sugar. People ask if they can have it first thing in the morning. Again, I have some people that thrive doing that and they feel so good. They'll even put a little bit of magnesium in theirs and they feel amazing. And then I would have others that would definitely crash right after. So I think it's all about that experimentation.
Yeah. Just having protein or fat with that can really be helpful.
Yeah.
Well, we talked in the beginning about your Instagram, but we didn't mention where people can find you. So this has been amazing. And we really love you. Have a lot of great stuff. You teach people a lot about this. So where can people find you to learn more?
Yeah, so I talk a lot about minerals on my Instagram at Hormone Healing RD. I also have a podcast called Are You Menstrual? And that one, I do a lot of deep dives on that for minerals too and other topics. So if you really like to nerd out, definitely check out the podcast.
Awesome. And you have programs too, right?
Yeah, I have the Master Your Minerals course, and it teaches you it walks you through every part of the hair test and helps you understand like what your results mean and why are your minerals, why do they turn out this way in your test? And then what to do about it. Lots of different action steps that wrap it up.
That's
awesome.
Great. We love that. Well, thank you so much for coming on. You're amazing.
Thanks for having me. It was fun chatting with you guys.
Absolutely. It was so nice to meet you finally.
You too.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. And if you love this episode, please leave a review. It only takes a couple minutes. And you can find out more about us on drbeckycampbell.com. And you can follow us over at Instagram on @HealthBabesPodcast, @Dr. Becky Campbell, and @Dr. Crystal Hohn. Have an amazing day.